this 45th chapter is titled Being a Woman in Spiritual India. And what I love about this is that you can either relate to that, you can relate to what it's like to being a woman, being in a spiritual place, being spiritual yourself, and thus this book validates you. Or if there are parts that we can't relate with, then we still benefit, because then we gain a new perspective. So either way, I hope this book touches your heart and my words relax you. This is January of 2013, and I was 11 years old. India has had a complex relationship with women, and religious India's relationship with women is even more complex. Hindu tradition worships the divine feminine reverentially. 18 days a year are dedicated to the worship of the mother goddess in her different forms. There are temples exclusively dedicated to the mother goddess, and even in others dedicated, for example, to Lord Krishna or Lord Shiva, you are likely to find an elaborately decorated image of Ma Durga or Ma Kali or Ma Lakshmi. Among the many high court judges and political figures who have served India, Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister for 15 years, and Pratibha Patil, a gentle, motherly figure, was President for 5. On the religious and the practical and political levels, India is quite progressive in honoring women's rights and empowerment. At the same time, sexual harassment is far too common, as are domestic violence, rapes, and murders. More and more organizations are forming to drag this monster out of the closet of denial and into the daylight of awareness and action. Women's empowerment training programs in villages and cities are growing to provide not only sewing and handicrafts, but also karate. This is one of the reasons our global interfaith WASH Alliance is working so ardently for the provision and use of toilets. When millions of girls and women in rural villages don't have a toilet at home, they have to go into fields and forests to heed the call of nature. They are easy prey not only for wild animals, but also for men. Toilets in their homes provide safety and security, along with obvious health and hygiene benefits. But that lack of safety, whether on the streets of Delhi or in the rural villages, while trying to defecate in a field, is not something I've personally experienced in India. I have never felt unsafe on any street or dirt pathway of the country. Granted, of course, I am never out alone. I live in a cocoon of which I am acutely aware, a safe, protected, tightly woven existence of care, love, and respect. And yet the undercurrent of misogyny exists, only in a different way. As the tradition of sannyas, of renunciation, is seen as the highest level of religious leadership, and as the vows of sannyas include non-negotiable vows of celibacy, and as the overwhelming majority of sannyasis are men, there is a mostly unspoken denigration of all things female. I never travel with women, and I never have women around me, or commonly used sentiments or statements to impress listeners with the strength of the speaker's religious convictions, purity, and integrity. Conversely, he is always surrounded by women implies that he is corrupt and impure and of a lower caliber. Segregating men from women during worship is common in Orthodox traditions around the world. My mother grew up in attending an Orthodox Jewish synagogue where the men sat separately from the women. But after the service, my mom, her brothers, my grandmother, and my grandfather all walked home together. My mom and grandma were not expected to walk behind the men, nor were they expected to travel in separate cars. In India, though, there is an implicitly accepted understanding that the mere presence of a woman, even if that woman is also a sannyasi, a nun, and therefore has also taken the vows of celibacy, brings impurity. The holier the place, the higher level of religious leaders present, the less likely that a woman will be on the stage. The first time I was subjected to this tradition was in the Kumbh Mela in 2013. Prior to that, as my years in India went by, and as I did more and more public speaking, I found myself on more and more stages, shared by both women and men. But in the religious world, mostly with men. I hadn't thought about my presence as a woman other than to notice that I was frequently the only woman on stage. I began accepting invitations to speak because I knew that if I didn't go, there would be no woman on the stage. I went so any girl or woman who wanted to take to a path of spirituality would see that there is also room for women. The doorway to God and to religious leadership is open to all. The Kumbh Mela is seen as the holiest of holy times, and the place where it takes place, the holiest of holy lands. We were visiting the Kumbh camp of one of the most revered saints, a man I knew well, revered immeasurably, and loved dearly, someone I had spent a great deal of time with over the years at his ashram, at our ashram, and in many other places. The stage was filled with 50 or 60 of India's most respected religious leaders, all men, seated according to seniority. As Swamiji and I entered, the ushers took him reverently onto the center of the stage, and he sat in front with the saint whose event it was and the other most senior leaders. The ushers lovingly walked me up the stage and showed me where to sit, in the second row, off to the side. As I settled into my seat and crossed my legs, one of the most respected saints, who I also knew well and loved dearly, rose from his seat and motioned for me to follow him. I jumped up immediately. I am so sorry to have to say this, but I've been sent by the saint whose event it was, to tell you that this is just a Mahatma, a great soul stage. The word Mahatma is colloquially used to mean male religious leaders or saints. He looked at me lovingly and said, I am sorry, but there are no women allowed. My eyes filled with tears, and he clearly felt awful to have to tell me. I flopped my head left and right as respectfully as I could. I'd become expert at the Indian head signal that means no problem. Sure. I then bent down to touch the ground in front of his feet. I was afraid that if I spoke, my voice would crack, so I just turned to walk down the stairs. They are putting a chair for you in front, he said. But instead of walking to the chair, I exited from backstage onto the Mela grounds. It was the heat of the afternoon, after lunch and before dinner, a time when most people were either napping or sitting in one of the hundreds of makeshift tented halls. I walked and walked until I got to the banks of the river, where it was thankfully quiet. I sat on a log with my back to the sun and cried. I hadn't felt that alone since elementary school, when the girls in my class would form "We Hate So-and-So" clubs, each day dedicated to a different victim. One day I had walked into school to discover that no one would talk to me. They only pointed at me and giggled. I must have been the so-and-so that day, and I experienced a sense of loneliness that day I'd never felt before or after. As a child, I loved being alone. Whether doing art projects, photography, reading, playing handball against the garage door, or swimming and lying in the sun, I was always happy alone. But rejection was entirely different. There must be something wrong with me to be it today. I had thought on that day of 5th grade. To this day, I can still tap into the pangs of isolation I felt. As I took my walk of shame out the back of the Kumbh tent and down to the riverbed, I felt those pangs again. It's just your ego, I told myself. So what if you can't sit on the stage? You think you deserve to sit on the stage with India's holiest saints? Get over it. Who do you think you are? I berated myself for a while, and I vowed to work harder on my ego. But something wasn't right. Rather than the clear spaciousness I feel when truth has been revealed, rather than the stillness I feel when I let go of another layer of false identity and sink deeper into my true self, rather than that spaciousness and stillness, I felt a tug. Something in my heart tugged on me to listen. This is not about you. This is not about being on that stage. It's about being female. Being male or female is one of the most fundamental aspects of who we are in this finite, time-bound body, much deeper than our identification as our professions, our relationships, or our financial or social status. To be pushed away due to something over which I had no control, something I could not meditate away or pray away or puja away, which means worship away, something I could not renounce away or serve away, to be unworthy of presence due to something that fundamental and which I loved and never wanted to change, filled me with despair, indignation, and gratitude simultaneously. Despair that I would be forever rejected, indignation that I should be rejected on the basis of gender, and gratitude because I realized that in that moment, hunched over a log on the banks of the confluence of the sacred Ganga, Yamuna, and Saraswati, 3 female goddesses, holy, sacred, divine rivers that, despite or because of their femininity, were not only pure themselves, but were also the bestowers of purity on others. I realized as I scooped water up to my face to wash it with their waters that I was being pushed to a deeper level of anchoring. I was being pushed into an inner expansion that had to make room for the simultaneous embrace of my femininity and of the world that rejected it. To be grounded not in having a place on the stage, but in having a place in my own self. There would be stages where I'd be welcome, and there'd be stages I was not permitted on. My task was to understand that lack of acceptance on a stage does not undermine the presence of spirit, that females not being permitted somewhere does not undermine the power and purity of the divine feminine. People travel from across the world to bathe in the female rivers of India in order to attain purity. I could send the paradox into my brain where it would eat away at me, or I could send it into my heart. The heart can create space enough to embrace a world where they pray to the goddess, but don't believe that women's souls are great enough to be a Mahatma. A world where we are taught that there is nothing but God, and where the teachers of this truth see women and men as separate. I have not fully resolved this paradox, but I work to expand the space within me until there is room for all sides of the paradox, in which I revere and adore these leaders and feel deeply grateful for the opportunity to be with them. And at the same time, if I were in charge of the rules, I would declare that women's souls are also Maha, great, that the presence of female energy certainly does not defile, and in fact uplifts male energy, and in that ever-growing spaciousness, I worship the goddess in the form of Mother Ganga, Mahalakshmi, Kali, and Durga, in the form of Radha, Mirabai, and Sita Ma, and in the very female body I was given. In that spaciousness, I can worship the feminine while still worshipping the saints who would have kicked her off a Mahatma stage. This is the spaciousness I seek in my heart. This is the expansion of consciousness I meditate on. There's room for it all. There is nothing but God. Thank you for listening. What a heartfelt, empowering, and yet humbling passage on femininity in India as it pertains to spirituality and religion. I hope you enjoyed that reading. Hope it expanded your understanding as much as it did mine. And affirm any femininity within you. Namaste.